For quite a while we lived at West Wyalong in New South Wales, but then moved to Manly, also in New South Wales, where I did my education. My father was a World War II veteran, but he died in 1945. So that left my mother in a fairly difficult circumstance, but she was a really tough woman, and she had to make a lot of sacrifices for us. And I distinctly remember her saying, "The only thing I'm ever going to give you, children, is an education." And of course I valued that a lot. I always wanted to do medicine. I don't know when that idea came into my mind, but we were mindful of the financial difficulties that were going to be involved with that. And so when I started in medicine, I was like lots of other students. We had jobs, and I worked in a variety of jobs. I worked with the Shire Council. I worked with the Darling Harbour Goodyards. I worked as a cleaner. But I got to the point where things were really getting tough. And by this time, I'd done my national service. And during that time, I learned of a scheme that the Defence Force was putting up to have an undergraduate scheme whereupon they would finance your undergraduate education for a return of service. So reluctantly at the time I applied for that, and to my surprise I was selected. So that's how I got into the army, and that's how I got through medicine. Well, it's an interesting thing. I was quite bewildered by the whole thing, really. I mean, we were 18, and the experience was good. I really enjoyed it. The camaraderie and friendship with the fellas was good. Interestingly enough, I was trained. We all did the basic training as infantry soldiers. So I was quite familiar with all the weapons and reasonably good at using them, I think. And it was interesting that when I joined the regular army and went to Malaya and then to Vietnam, at no time was I asked had I had any weapon training. And finally, when I was required to carry a weapon in Vietnam, I chose the Owen. Because I was very familiar with that weapon and I liked it. I don't know that it was a very effective weapon, certainly not at long range, but it was easy to carry, easy to use, and I was familiar with it. Yes, it used to make me chuckle a bit that while I was doing all this stuff with an infantry battalion, I don't ever remember being asked, had I had any military training? I don't think the regular army was in really good shape. Numbers were down, and they had an infantry battalion on service in Malaya, and I'd just come back from there. But I think they were hard pushed to keep an infantry battalion in Vietnam, and that's of course why the second national service came in. But that national service was vastly different to mine. It was for 2 years with the likelihood of being posted to Vietnam, as many of them were. So, I just carried that experience along quietly, and I think it was valuable. I knew generally how to behave and out in the bush, not make a fool of yourself or get in the road. And I think you learn. You learn pretty quickly anyway. When I went to Malaya, I was posted to a British Army medical unit, which was a great experience, and I learned a lot. And one of the important lessons I learned was that malaria was drug resistant, to all the known agents that we had at the time. That hadn't been generally accepted around the world, but it was a fact. It was well proved in Malaya, and I was a small cog in the wheel in that machine that was investigating it. And so I had that experience. And also I was able to fly from Malaya to Vietnam for a short period of time, for a look-see. I think the business we were getting soft intelligence. For instance, one of the things I did was look at the Army Republic Vietnam hospital system, which was pretty wanting. It was not very sophisticated, and but I was also met up with members of the Australian Army training team, went out to a couple of their posts. Yeah, so I had a fair idea of what was going on in Vietnam before I was posted there. My look-see was I could go where I liked, when I liked, for the period I was there, in bounds of safety. But when I went up to Vietnam, I was posted to the Army Force Vietnam. I was not posted to 1RAR. But everything was so disorganised, and it was quite an experience. I used to use the word shambles to describe it. And the medical officer that was posted to the battalion, a nice young bloke, had only been in the army for a very short period of time, he was carrying quite a significant medical problem, and that annoyed everybody, including the commander. This young man was unfit to be there, and in fact he didn't last a week. He was very embarrassed about it, but he had to go home. So for a period of time I was doing both jobs. I was acting as the senior medical officer to the force, and I was acting as the RMO to the battalion. And I carried that on throughout the time they were there. I think I probably did about 50% of their operations. So yes, it was a very busy time. That year just vanished. It was, if I wasn't out in the bush, I was in Saigon doing all the administrative stuff that was required. We were confronting the problem of malaria, which was probably the biggest manpower waster right through the war, I would have thought, because any fellow who got one form of malaria, the falciparum variety, became so ill that they lost so much weight and physical condition, they just weren't fit to return to duty, so they had to be evacuated back to Australia. So I knew I had that experience before I left. I think, one young man died from malaria, and in a lot of ways, I think we were fortunate, we were lucky not to have more. And that problem existed until, I think about 1969, when a new prophylactic drug, dapsone, was introduced, and that just stopped the problem. It was I like to say the graph fell off the cliff. It was a vertical from a big incidence to almost zero in a very quick time. So that problem was solved. Yes, that was a very interesting aspect of being in Vietnam for me. I was mightily impressed by the American logistics support system. It was just overwhelming. We had absolutely no experience like that in Australia, and it was vast. And I mean, they were so generous. If we required anything, it was available. As far as working with 173rd Brigade, that was the unit to which we were attached or inserted. 1RAR was part of it. I think the soldiers were aware that they had been better trained, that our leadership was probably better trained and more experienced. and I think our blokes thought they were pretty good. They were better than the Americans. I think that's a reasonable comment to make. I think if you ask them, they'd probably express it in more expressive terms than I just did. This was a big innovation that the Americans had dedicated helicopters as heli ambulances, and their name was Dust-Off. Often asked how they got that name, but didn't get a satisfactory answer. But it meant that when a casualty occurred, the battalion could call on heli ambulance support, which was prompt, very prompt. And so that our people, our medics in the field, would do their first aid on the casualty. In a very short period of time, a heli ambulance would arrive, the Dust-Off would arrive, the bloke would be loaded on board and off. So he could be in a hospital in a matter of hours, sometimes less. It was truly a remarkable thing, and we'd had no experience with that at all. It was a game changer. And that was right through the whole of the Vietnam War. They eventually had an independent unit, a medical brigade, and they were responsible for all in-country evacuations of wounded casualties, and they would then hand them over to USAF for out-of-country evacuation. And it was controlled. Once a helicopter picked up a load of casualties, a medical regulator who was in charge would direct them to which hospital they would go. It was just so good. If the helicopter crew, for instance, reported they had a man with a gunshot wound or a head injury, they would direct him to a neurosurgical hospital. It was really an important factor in the management of our casualties. After the first trip, I went to England to study tropical medicine. Amused me a bit. I'd been in Malaya for a couple of years, I'd been to Vietnam for 1 year, and then the army decided to send me to England to do this training. I didn't mind that at all. I was aware that there was a very good school of tropical medicine in Sydney, but they chose to send me to the London School of Tropical Medicine, so I accepted that. And when I completed, as well as doing that study, I was able to visit and be attached to quite a number of British Army units in England. One of them was the Parachute Field Ambulance, and I learned a lot there. And then I returned to Australia, and I was promoted, and I was in charge of the 2nd Military Hospital in Ingleburn. And that was, an important experience, because that was the reception hospital for casualties returning from Vietnam. So we were seeing what was happening, and more than that, our surgical staff was getting experience in the sort of wounds that were being incurred by our people. So I was happily posted there for a couple of years, and then up to Vietnam again, and eventually posted to one Australian Field Hospital. And that was probably the keynote experience of my military experience. I was in charge of a wonderful team of people who were very dedicated towards the cause, very dedicated to looking after our wounded people, our sick people. They were a very good team. I was very surprised at the progress that our people had made, When 1RAR arrived, we were given virtually amounted to a field, and that's where you live, men. So we had to construct all the engineering, health engineering, to live comfortably and safely, but that was all intense. The battalion worked very hard. They would do an operation and come back, have only a short spell, and they're out again. And so it was tough work for them. Just before I left, Bill Rogers had arrived in country with two field ambulance, and they were located at Vung Tower. So I went down there with Bill to have a look at the site. It was virtually on the beach on the South China Sea. You know, in some ways, a good location. Not pretty difficult to operate a field hospital or a camp a field ambulance on the sand under tents. So they had difficulties. But when I arrived back there, a few years later, 69, there was virtually an Australian town. Everything, it was there. The hospital was functional. It was air conditioned. It was still being developed, but everything was under control. Roads, airfields, a swimming pool, everything. It was not at the hospital, but in the area. So everybody was living. Every man and woman that was working in the Vung Tau area lived in some form of hutted accommodation with all the facilities to live comfortably or reasonably comfortably. It was a major change. I was really surprised. The engineers must have worked really hard for that period of time. I was still very interested in tropical medicine. That was a feature in the medical wards. But I became more and more involved in the mechanism of receiving badly wounded men and resuscitating them and getting them into the operating theatre. So yes, I worked at that. I had a really good support in the administrative staff, and I could communicate with them all the time. It wasn't a problem. I don't think it was a problem. The unit was really a self-starting outfit. Nobody needed to be pushed. They knew what they had to do. They wanted to do it, and they did it well. The nurses were only 12 in number, 10 or 12 in number, and it was a 100-bed hospital. Take the operating theatre, for instance. There was a staff of 12, but only one nurse. The rest of them were known as operating theatre technicians. Good lads. Some of them were national servicemen. Probably half of them were national servicemen. So it meant that their journey, in 1 year, they'd been inducted into the military. They'd been trained as basic military training. Then they'd been trained as army medics, and then had gone on and trained as operating theatre technicians. All this in 1 year. And the next thing, they're in Vietnam at the coalface. Now that put a lot of pressure on the nurse who was running the operating theatre. She was responsible for maintaining the standards, and it was a classic example of how they worked together as a team. I knew that lady pretty well, actually, and I'm sure she'll talk about that later. But it was great teamwork. The lads really looked up to her, and that was generally right through the whole hospital. Some people have mentioned there was a bit of antipathy towards the girls when they first came up because the men had been doing the work and there was some resentment. I didn't see any evidence of that. The girls were really responsible for maintaining the standard, and to do that they were required to do on-the-job training to get the skills up that they required, and in general terms they succeeded in doing that very well. I would think in today's situation, an operating theatre with 12 people running it, there would be 12 nurses, all trained. So there was one nurse and the lads, the theatre techs. Some of them were regular soldiers and had a fair bit of experience, but as I say, some of them were national servicemen who had no experience. So it was really a remarkable achievement, I thought. The first thing would happen would be that we would get a communication from a helicopter carrying wounded that they were inbound. They would tell us how many they had on board, and they would then tell us how many minutes before they were going to arrive. So that meant that our little hospital had to come to a state of readiness. We used to send off a siren, which used to be would stop you in your tracks. Not only for the hospital, everybody in the logistics support group area could hear that, and they realised that once again wounded people were on their way in. So they would arrive at our helipad. Our call sign was Vampire. Yeah. And so they'd arrive on the helicopter. We would do a rapid assessment of how badly injured the man was. We would make sure that he had no weapons on him, especially if they were wounded prisoners of war. Make sure they weren't armed and likely to cause problems. They would be then hand carried down to the triage area, where they would be examined carefully. We used to strip off their clothes. This was done while they were on a stretcher on the floor. Strip off their clothes, and then they would be lifted bodily off the stretcher onto an examination trolley, a resuscitation trolley, so we could examine the undersurface of his back and his buttocks and all that, make sure there weren't wounds on the back that we couldn't see, didn't want to miss them. And so then he'd be laid down and the process of pain relief and resuscitation would take place. We became pretty good at that. New techniques were developed, especially as far as pain relief was concerned, a very important thing to do. And the process would proceed until the resuscitation was brought to the point where he was fit to go into the operating theatre to have surgery done on his wounds. Some of the wounds that these fellows suffered were very severe, horrific, and there's no doubt in my mind that if we didn't have the heli-ambulance support available under conventional methods of transport that were experienced in previous wars, many of those men would not have arrived alive at the hospital. No doubt about that at all. In saying that, it meant that the pressure was on us to look after badly injured people. And I think we're very proud of the fact that, I can't remember the exact percentage, but the boys at reunions remind me that 98% of the people who arrived alive were saved, which is pretty good. Many of them were as a result of anti-personnel mines and devastating injury to the lower limbs. And the frequency of amputations of limbs caused concern. I can remember a couple of the surgeons became very emotional about the fact that they had to do that procedure. And so we decided we'd have a committee of 3 people, me, the CO, and the surgeon, and one other person, one other doctor, and we'd say, yeah, look, we agree that this man has to have that, and then we would take it in turns to inform the bloke what was going to happen. And they generally knew. I mean, they knew that they were in a bad way, and I can't remember the exact fellow, but it's always in my mind that when I went over to one young bloke to say, look, your limb is pretty badly smashed, he said, yeah, mate, I've had a deco. It's rat shit, isn't it? And he knew it had to go. And yeah, they were interesting people, tough guys. We had one bloke who was a vascular surgeon, and good, but he was a good general surgeon too. And as I say, they were all members of the ADF as reservists. And so they used to come up mainly for a period of 3 months, but some of them, quite a few of them, stayed for 6. And they'd had the advantage of understanding the sort of surgical procedures that they might have to be involved with. And they used to go around the various hospitals in their city and do a bit of thoracic surgery. Nothing heroic as far as neurosurgery was concerned, but how to enter and decompress a brain. But having said that, you have to understand that by the time we're talking now, 69, 70, the Americans had very specialised units around. So if we had a man who had a severe head injury, probably we wouldn't expect to receive him. Probably he would go to a neurosurgical hospital. But if we needed to transfer him, no problem. It was that sort of interconnectedness that made things really work. The Americans could produce a specialised burns unit, everything, thoracic unit, and as I say, a neurosurgical unit. So we were all operating together. One of the things I probably should have said is that the medical regulating officer that I've spoken to you about, he was regulating the heli ambulance support. He also wanted to know the working capacity of our hospital. So if we were working hard, he would probably try not to send more casualties to us. He would send casualties to a hospital that was probably not working as hard. And so that was part of the deal, part of the process of looking after the casualties. I think a lot of us became skilled in resuscitation, airway management. Some of the equipment that we had was pretty basic, but it improved while we were there. For instance, I think, if you go into a hospital now and have an intravenous line put up, nobody would even think about the equipment that they're using. But it was only in Vietnam that they first introduced that sort of intravenous catheter. Simple things like that, but which made such a lot of difference, so much easier to use, so quicker. So we became pretty good at resuscitating people. One of the things that was innovative was that we were concerned about the blood supply through the system. By the time we got the blood through the American system, I always understood it had been mainly collected in Japan, but by the time we got it, it was pretty old. And so we were running into certain complications, and we thought it would be better if these young fellas had fresh blood. So we decided to collect blood from our own people in the Vung Tower area, in the logistics support group. And these the young people, they just, after a while, when they knew casualties were coming in, they could hear the siren. They used to collect ready to offer their blood. They'd even form up in blood groups. And some of the blood that we got taken from those young men didn't see the inside of a refrigerator. and I make the joke that depending on the time of day it was collected, there probably could be a reasonable dose of medicinal alcohol as well. But we thought at the time that really did improve the outcome for our people, getting fresh blood. I don't know whether you could do it today. See, we didn't know some of the hazards for blood transfusion that are available now, that are present now, like hepatitis B and C and HIV. They were not around. They were not around at the time. It was innovative, no doubt about it. I can remember one of the criticisms, or potential criticism. It wasn't a criticism; it was a query. Have you considered perhaps one of these donors might have syphilis? And we had considered that, and along the line of their treatment, a lot of these blokes were getting quite large doses of penicillin. So if there's any spirochete hanging around, it would have been promptly dealt with. No, we didn't, and syphilis wasn't a prevalent disorder in Vietnam troops, and we didn't have, we thought about it, but we didn't think that was a problem. I remember one boy died virtually as soon as he arrived. There was no conversation, nothing. He just died before we could do anything. But I remember another lad who was really badly injured, and he knew too. And so I said to him, perhaps you need your minister of religion more than you need us. He agreed, he knew, and he accepted that, and so he died very quickly, and with his priest with him, and I think that in that circumstance that was the best we could do. I remember one female prisoner of war. She was a mine lifter, and she had the mine had detonated while she was lifting it, so her injuries were horrific. And she was blind, and there was no chance of survival. So we made it comfortable and allowed her to slip away, which didn't take long again either. She died very quickly. It was a tribute to the fact of how quickly people could be picked up and put from the battle casualty scene to the hospital. It was so rapid. Sometimes it was under an hour or an hour, something, as short as that. Mainly it was a bit longer, but it was in the terms of hours, not days. And that can't, in Australia, right now today, that sometimes can't be achieved. So, it was really an important factor in the survival of wounded people. But having said that, we were conscious that some of these people had terrible trauma, and we were aware that their rehabilitation back in Australia was going to be difficult. And indeed, some of those people underwent surgical procedures for quite a long period of time when they got back to Australia. And we were always concerned about the psychological aspects of that. But our job was to do the best we could to keep them alive, and and that's what we did. But we were conscious, very conscious, and we've met up with a lot of the people who were badly injured. Not sure whether I should mention names, but there's a bilateral amputee from Western Australia who entered Parliament. As far as I know, he has led a good, happy life, and I think a lot of the men did do well. And I met a lot of of the men that had suffered serious injuries, and they picked up their pieces pretty well. I think, in general, the support back in Australia, apart from a few aspects of returning to an unfriendly sort of a community in some aspects, was pretty good. We were pretty distressed that, and I witnessed this back in Australia, both before I went to Vietnam for the second time and when I got back, that there were people in the community who would abuse our wounded. I felt that was disgusting. One or two pollies, I reckon, if they were around within a metre, I think I probably would have had to deal with them. It was pretty hard. I think, and I've often pondered whether that sort of a thing how much of an adverse effect on the psychological health that had on many of our veterans. I think probably I think it would be a significant factor. They were young, feisty women. Let me tell you, having being the commanding officer of the only unit that had eligible young women around, had a few challenges, but not serious ones. No, they're good girls, and they worked hard. You're dead right. They worked long hours. They were supposed to work long shift. I think it was in the order of 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, something like that. We relaxed as much as we could. We had the girls were highly respected, and we did what we could to relieve the pressure on them. But it was, we had the advantage of the beach. The girls could go down there if they wished. They could go for a swim. And as I say, they were young people, and they were living their life to the fullest under the circumstances, and I think they did it very well and appropriately. As far as psychological concerns for the girls was concerned, I think really we looked hard at that, and we did evacuate 2 of our nurses with psychological problems, but they were more related to social issues than their experiences at the time in the hospital. But I'm aware of the fact that a lot of the girls have had problems since they've returned to Australia. You used to get some sort of an inkling into how upset they were when it came for time to evacuate people back to Australia. We used to have the RAF used to put in a Hercules evacuation aircraft every fortnight, more often if we needed it. And so we used to get these young people lined up, ready to fly back to Australia via Malaya. Before they left, everybody that wasn't doing anything, or even if they were doing something, would assemble to sort of say goodbye. It was a fairly emotive and social occasion, and I was aware that some of the girls who were present for that sort of a occasion were very concerned about how these young people were going to be able to deal with their life back in Australia. And it was no surprise to me that when we got back to Australia to learn that some of the girls were indeed suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. But unless we were, no, I don't think we missed it. There was no real evidence of any serious psychological disorder amongst the girls at the time. In fact, I'd say the morale of the unit was pretty high. They lived in a compound that was surrounded by a fence. I don't know that the fence would have done any major protection, but I forget what they used to call it, but there were, one of the nurses would probably be able to remind you of that. They were highly regarded, and they were cared for, and nobody, I would think that anybody who behaved badly towards them would have been dealt with fairly harshly by the soldiers themselves. And apart from, as I say, there were a couple of social issues where I think people behaved badly. I don't know that there's any real problem. You know, the girls themselves behaved very well. I mean, they were sensible, they were fun-loving, sure, but they were sensible people who behaved properly. And that's about it. As far as I was concerned, they were not a problem. They were just good, hard-working people that we were used to working with anyway, and there was no, no, as far as I was concerned, no administrative difficulties at all. There was never any discipline troubles. They behaved very well indeed and worked hard. That particular operation was a bit of a disaster, and there were a lot of serious casualties. I can't remember now how many casualties we received, but they just seemed to be kept coming, and I know that we had to work for a long. I think we were going for about 36 hours actually, something like that, and it meant that we had to make sure that the surgeons were getting adequate relief. I remember one of our surgeons, I said to him, Peter, we're going to send you up for a rest. Oh no, he said, no, I'm okay. I said, no, you please do what you're told. Okay, so a couple of the lads took him up, and they reckon he was asleep before he was horizontal. 4 hours later, he's back, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready to get into it. We just had to do the job, and I think in their life in general, surgeons are used to doing that sort of thing. The support from the unit was great. You know, I can remember at one point feeling pretty tired and all the rest of it. And what happens? I think it was in the early hours of the morning. I can't remember. In comes the Bain Marie from the cooks, providing food and drink and sustenance for the team to have a quick meal break and get on with it. And it was that sort of community spirit that just kept us going. And yes, the memory of that period is, even though it's 50 years ago, it's still fairly strong. That how well it proved to me how well our unit could work. It was really great. Well, Denis, interesting man. He was in country in 1966 when I was in country, but we didn't meet. And I didn't meet him until I came back to the hospital in '69. And Denis, very flamboyant, outspoken man who had been there for a fair while. '66 he arrived, I think. And I was advised that he should not be permitted to use our officers' mess. And I was a bit surprised at that, and that wasn't the only piece of request that was made to me that I didn't follow up on. So I just do what I normally do. I met up with Denis and said, look, mate, you can use our mess as long as you behave like a responsible citizen. You'll have no problems. And we had no problems with Denis. He was a charming bloke. He was an interesting man. He was a botanist, and I found that intriguing, that here he is as a botanist running around with a camera, getting himself into all sorts of troubles. He was intelligent, and he could hold he behaved like a gentleman with the ladies and with the officers of the hospital. I don't know that anybody ever had anything but admiration for Denis. We were all intrigued by the fact that he used to go out on operations with the men. We were always aware, or I was aware, that he had a terrific rapport with the soldiers, the average soldier. They used to come to Denis for advice, I think. That used to bother me a bit. But no, seriously, he was a good bloke, and I enjoyed him. And one of the things that I don't think we realised at the time, that Denis was compiling a record, a photographic record, which we now understand to be outstanding. And I think it was, I'm not exactly sure when, but he came and said, look, he's got a commission from a magazine in Australia. I thought it was Women's Weekly, but that might be wrong, to do an article on the nurses. And I said, yeah, go for it. But I said, look, Denis, while you're at it, how about you photograph the hospital? Well, I didn't realise what that meant. Denis photographed the hospital, all right, every aspect of it, and now is a terrific record. Without that intervention, without that effort by Denis, we would never have had the record that we've got. It's invaluable, and I'm glad that Sean has got hold of it, and he's looking after it properly. We had a specialist in medicine, a general physician. We had a psychiatrist, a pathologist, and two surgeons and two anaesthetists. We had two surgical teams, and they were all reservists, and most of them stayed for 3 months because they had busy practices and things like that. Some of them, a couple I can think of, stayed for 6 months. And there was one example, one fellow who he'd taken the opportunity of researching the sort of injuries that were being handled in Vietnam, and he'd done some work. He'd prepared himself by going to various specialists and in thoracic surgery and all that. And he came up and he did some really. He was well prepared to do some really tough surgery, and I remember it drew the admiration of the American consultant surgeon, and it was, no doubt, it saved the bloke's life. It was really very good work. So yeah, we were well served by our specialists. I think we would say that almost without exception they were very highly proficient and did a good job. I was all set to go home at one point, and I was advised that my replacement was ill. I never ever found out who he was, but would I be prepared to stick on for another 6 months? So I agreed to that, and an interesting thing happened when the commander of the force learned of it, or he approved it. he said, "But you're going home for some leave, young fella." So I actually went back to Australia for a couple of weeks, and then went back again. Yes, I was not. I wouldn't. I don't know whether you'd say enjoying it was the right time, but I was the right expression. But I was quite prepared to stay for another 6 months. It was it was a really good unit, and it was a very rewarding experience to be with the people that were there. We just knew that the thing was winding down, and I just resumed what you normally do as a medico back in Australia. So there was no big difficulty for me, and I went to St Vincent's in Sydney and did some extra work, extra training. No, I just slipped back into my usual life pattern. I don't think it's changed much. When I got to the point that I thought procedural work was a bit too onerous and you need to be on the ball, I decided to stop hospital work and ended up my time as a semi-retired doctor working with the Defence Force. and I did that until I retired. I left the army in about 78, I think. Yeah. And yeah, no, I was happy. I'd done enough, and things were looking good. I just had a comfortable life. I was happy doing what I was doing. Denis, look, he had an illness. I mean, he was in hospital a couple of times. If he was a soldier, he would have been evacuated. I told him that. Didn't cut much ice. No, he had he was wounded a couple of times. He look. Some people didn't enjoy Denis, but they didn't understand him. And I can remember one officer in particular, commanding officer of an infantry battalion, whom I knew very well, but I only met him there. But we established a good relationship. I said to him, "Look, meet the bloke, talk to the bloke, lay down your parameters, and you'll find you've got a mate." So the next thing, Denis is happily ensconced with that mob. He actually lived at the task force. He knew lots and lots of soldiers. He'd been on many not only operations with the Australians, he'd been on operations with other people, Americans. And I think in some ways might be people who envied that experience, the broadness of his experience. Denis was, he wouldn't stand back. He'd tell them what he thought. One of the things I liked about the bloke. He was a very vibrant, interesting man. And I don't think there were too many mean bones in Denis's body. He was a very generous, very friendly fellow. He was extremely polite to people who treated him well. But if I would imagine that if Denis was in conversation with somebody who had said something ridiculous, he would be very quick to point it out. And not much wrong with that.